I did not pay for that introduction. There used to be a program called Operation Crossroads Africa. It no longer, I don't project, so it no longer existed. And they were running it in the 70s and part of the 80s, saying they were looking for people who become leaders in future. You will write exam, you will write essays, they will select 12 people. And in 1980, I was privileged to have been selected. That was my first encounter with this university, because they asked us to indicate our interest, and I indicated oral traditions. So they brought me here. It was also at a time, and many of you may no longer remember, when some agencies, universities were also interested in what they call oral history. They were separating both. And then they also took me to the University of Mississippi, where they have the Southern Oral History Project. And then the Library of Congress to see the documents on the final years of slavery. It's still there, the documents are still there. Many of us have not put those documents to use. And from that encounter, other visitation followed. I came here, I think the African Studies program invited me for his annual lecture. Crawford Young invited me, and it was a very sad moment because we were hosting our conference when the news came, I think in this very room, I think, that the Abacha government had executed Saro-Wiwa. And that just damaged the mood of the conference. Some people began to cry. So, long history of encounters with this university, former students. And there are two generations, the Vansina generation, Philip Cotton, and their students. Some names are in the office there: Joseph Miller, Paul Lovejoy, Tom Spear. So there were two Nigerians in this part of the cluster, Agiri and Alagwa. Alagwa is still alive, by the way, but people tend to think it's no more. So Alagwa worked directly with Vansina, and he took that teaching back to Nigeria, where he became the most preeminent Nigerian scholar in the field of oral tradition. No question about that. In that preeminence, he became a Vansina disciple. You can't criticize Vansina wherever Alagwa is. You cannot. In fact, we used to taunt him when you want to make him angry, just criticize Vansina, because he was worshiping Vansina, his teacher. They used to credit people like people like D.K. Ajayi with the use of oral tradition, but they never use it. It's a myth. They said it many times, use oral traditions, but they never used it. D.K. towards the end of his life, with a female professor, wrote a book where he used oral traditions. So repeatedly, they kept saying, you must use oral tradition, you must use oral tradition. They never use it. So, and I will return to that down the road. I'm very grateful to this university for publishing my books. The program of African Studies, I published like 4 books with them. And Wisconsin University Press, they'll be releasing a book of mine, which I will return to. And the board has accepted a new series, which I proposed to University of Wisconsin Press. I call it the Yoruba War. And the first book will soon be released. And we have 2 in the pipeline. So I am part of your university in various dimensions. I want to recognize my friend who followed me to this lecture. Is a king. It's not a chief, he's a king. Because people tend to confuse that distinction. It's inherited from his father, Funkem Akane King the first, who also happens to be a professor 2 hours away from here. And I'm his chief. He gave me a chieftaincy title in Kengaese. Thanks for coming. Thank you. It's just came here in September. You got pizza. He graduated from us. Very brilliant guy. Extremely well read. And I'm very proud of him. Very, very proud of him. That is able to join you for his master's and subsequently for his PhD program. It won't disappoint you. I divided this lecture into 3 parts. I won't have the time for the 3rd part. I will have the time for 2 parts. The 3rd part you will enjoy, and then you ask me to come back. That's I don't know how to write short pieces. This lecture is 60 pages long. It's already written because I write all my lectures. And in the first part, it will talk about Vansina in terms of his contributions. And in the second part, I will speak to what happened after his death. When he died, we did some panels at the ASA, and it was a privilege for me to be part of it. Many of you may not know that he was angry towards the end of his life. And I was teasing my great professor there, Ali Tripp, that why do people get angry towards as they get to 70s and 80s? It's a very common phenomenon. I'm also getting angry myself at 73. And part of the anger derives from how we see the discipline moving towards a path we don't like. You understand? It's very common. Philip Cotton, the same thing, that why is this discipline moving in a direction we don't like? Now I will say more about that. For those of you who never met him, who don't know him, you're actually sharing part of his legacy without knowing him. That there were traditions in Africa, but you have to locate what it did in context and time after the Second World War, in which they gave Swas the credit of founding African history as a discipline. And if you read the memoir by Oliver, he claimed that credit. In claiming that credit, the slice of what we still don't talk about, and somebody should do a PhD topic, the contributions of African Americans to African history. So there's that ecosystem which is not fully connected to the academic field that started in the 40s, that Vansina, Roland Oliver belonged to, because it's a different trajectory. And that is yet to be cumulated into a major book. Indeed, the very definition of Africa we use is a Du Bois framing of Africa. It's Du Bois who framed it, putting Africa, saying you can't create Africa in the Middle East. That's how Du Bois framed Africa. But notice that I don't know about your program here. What Du Bois was saying don't do is how the American Academy has organized the field. On my campus, North Africa is not part of Africa. It's part of the Middle East. So Du Bois said, don't frame Africa like that. Why don't you fuse it? Or we've refused to do that. So in that strand, if you put Oliver Vansina there, you will do the biography very differently. Because if you give him credit for our traditions, you are not looking at the African-American strand and the African strand in which the very subject you call history is oral tradition. So you can do the Griot and Vansina. You can do a conversation on that. But if you accept Oliver's definition that African history began at Suez after the Second World War, then that context will shape your understanding of Jean Vansina. Because as at the time they were framing this new field, the focus was on writing and the archives. That was the focus. And the very first credit you have to give Vansina, because there's no question, as a pioneer. When he went to Central Africa, he didn't even go with that intention. He went with the intention of the way that discipline was defined, the search for archives. And the field now shaped its own trajectory. And that became one of his biggest contributions to African history. I mean, you can't mention oral tradition without mentioning his name. No question about that. And it trained people like Christopher Ehret, like David Enig, and all others who moved the field forward in a very profound way. And many of the students that they produce in this history department in African studies, they did three things which hold to how they characterize the field. They must understand languages. Vansina was insistent on linguistics. You can't just, it's no negotiation. And if you look at the idea that you can have a PhD without understanding two languages, that's part of the intellectual contributions. I don't know whether you still follow that tradition, but we still follow it on my campus. You must pass two languages before you can finish your PhD program. And they did that effectively. Let me be angry. Today, the constitution of PhD programs does not do longue durée. They don't do longue durée, in which you look for 300 years, 400 years. They all did longue durée. All of Vansina's books are longue durée. Part in the rainforest, savannah. These are large periods. And I've sat on virtually all award committees. And those who give these awards, they don't understand that conception. They don't, because they can only process 5 years, 10 years. They can't process a book like the one Christopher Ehret writes, in which you're covering 500 years. They are not trained to do that way. And the reason why they can't do it that way is because of the nature of archives, the difficulty of going to the field. Because for you to do longue durée, you just basically have to spend a long time in the field. So when I built the PhD program in Austin, you must live for 1 year. You have to go. But we fund it. We won't just say, go to the archives for 4 weeks. You have to go for 1 year. But that tradition, you must link it back to Madison and link it back to SOAS. In insisting that you have to go for 1 year, what Vansina and his generation did was not to make a separation between history and anthropology. Because if you read some of his scholarship, you will say this is anthropology, and this is history, and this is cultural history. When academic history got to Africa, that was how they were training PhD students. I did archeology for my PhD. It was not negotiable. You must do archeology, not negotiable. But that orientation now is no longer there. And you must do methodology. Now you can have a PhD without doing methodology. You can have a PhD for 2 weeks by photocopying archival records. You can now do a PhD without knowing the language. And a person like Vansina, he was exiting, began to get angry in terms of how the methodology was shifting. But the methodology also shifted in a very profound way. And you have to give them credit that part of what we now call decolonization, decoloniality, that was exactly what they were doing. They didn't call it that way, but they were decolonizing the field. They were decolonizing the methodology. And they saw themselves as the voices of the people they were writing about. Today, there's a disconnect. You can now write a PhD without the voice of the people we are writing about. Go and read Vansina, go and read Crawford Young, go and read Philip Cotton. They were also seeing themselves as ambassadors of Africans. Vansina, most especially. Read his book on Cuba, read all his books. It was as if, look, I am the historian of the people that I'm writing about. In other words, they were not creating that distance between themselves and the subjects the way we now structure a discipline. So one must give them credit for that representation. What we now call intersectionality, they were doing it. They were just calling it multidisciplinary. But the hybrid form that we claim today in terms of intersectionality, that is what they were doing. Go and read them. So the labels changed, but they anticipated us in so many ways. Because the very books Vansina was writing was about intersectionality, multidisciplinarity. It was woven into all his books. That's how they conceived that knowledge. And if you study them and you talk about ways of producing knowledge, in ways of producing knowledge, they didn't take a society and study it for 4 years. That was not what was doing. It has to be a long moment of history, a long period of history. Read Philip Cotton's on slavery and things like that. You will see how you cover 400 years. Or you read any of Vansina's book, they cover extensive areas. In that ways of producing knowledge, that methodology, I'm afraid to say, has declined. It has declined. And it has declined for a variety of reasons. In building that fame around oral traditions, if you study world history, they will mention Vansina. You can't do world history without mentioning his name. And the reason has to do with the fact that they're writing about Africa, but they are also inserting Africa into what we call world history. I went to Brazil when they were revising their syllabus, which is now mandatory. It was the number one figure that was mentioned in terms of how you use other traditions, because that field now connected to what you call indigenous studies, indigenous communities. His book was the Bible. In other words, it moved outside of African history to be inserted into other forms of history. So if you do anthropology, if you do Indian population, if you, I worked in Australia before. It was the most famous figure there. Why? Because of the relevance of his book. So in which the very conception of that traditions became global. It became global in terms of how it connected to all sorts of populations as dynamic sources, because it moved it beyond what they call folklore. So you can, when I was taught, the way we were taught was to use it as sources. You can do that. But later on, when I became independent, I was converting these ideas into epistemologies. There's a difference. As sources, you are adorning your footnotes and fortifying it, drawing from field work what they told you. As epistemologists, you take his ideas not as sources, because there's a very big difference, not as sources, but as indigenous epistemologies. In other words, that which he was talking about, you now cumulate them into saying that this is the centrality of the constitution of knowledge itself. And I'm going to close this conversation with that. So we can't thank him enough for his tremendous contribution. And thank you. And it did, as if you move his career forward, you now find him in 3 projects. He remains vital to digital humanities. Himself will be shocked because that field had not been created when he was alive. But if you are doing digital humanities, you must read him. And if you are doing public history at the level of research, you must read him. Reading him doesn't mean you agree with him, but you cannot escape reading him. And if you do world oral history projects, you just don't have a choice. In other words, the books last. And the reason why his books last is because it was a methodological revolution. It was a revolution. And we must give him credit for that revolution. So, contemporary decoloniality will say you must critique Eurocentrism. They were all doing that. But they were not framing it that way. I mean, Vansina was critiquing Eurocentrism. If you read his memoirs, he was clear about that. And In doing that, why they belong to that ecosystem of SOAS and of Wisconsin, they were also self-sabotaging. Because you can self-sabotage. And what they're saying, they will also use their talent to demolish Eurocentrism. Because you can't do his writing grounded in those oral traditions and at the same time be fully Eurocentric. Part of the challenge, because we invited him to Lagos and I was asked to come and criticize him, which I did. It wasn't the age of computer. I was always writing. He was using the regular pen and paper and sometimes a typewriter. I wrote 35 pages and he replied back in 35 pages because that was the way he processed arguments. That in the critique, and the students also critique him, it's not just me, in which you say, okay, how do we use unstable narratives to explain stability? Or how do you use a handful to construct long gray? I can attest to that possibility because my PhD wasn't archival records. My PhD was in oral tradition. I studied families, histories of families to do my PhD. That's what I did, in which learning from the methodology, I was going from one family to another, accumulating the data. If we have used oral traditions to write a book before, our notes are not as extensive as those who go to the archives. If you go to the archives, you can come back home with 1,000 pages, 500 pages. Oral traditions don't work like that. My notebook for my PhD, it's so small. And we developed the capacity to do a lot of intellectual extractions. But you cannot fall on the use of oral traditions without understanding the voice of the people, without giving legitimacy to your subject. It's not going to work. How is it going to work? If you live among them, you study them, you are using their tropes, and that voice is critical and is now missing. When you look at his work, you will see the shifts from migration to fundamentalism to culture change to development of political systems. It was the very first scholar that demolished our use of centralized and non-centralized because it didn't, that binary could not be fitted into the kind of data he was collecting. And drawing from language, which people don't do today, enables the insertion of idioms and variances into interpretation. So loss of ethnography. So you can contest the definition of history itself, which we do. But how do you read pathways in the rainforest without going back to how Africans were defining their own history? We have a king here, we can contribute to it, in which you can't just say it's a secular field. It doesn't work that way. You can't say, I'm writing the history of Mali using the griot and be secularizing the data. It doesn't work that way. Because the data you are being confronted with is embedded in cosmologies. And that is not the way they will train you in your first degree, in which they will set aside those cosmologies. It's set aside because in that secularizing process, you are imposing a definition that those voices we never accept. And it's important to understand that in his writings, you are going to find a large dose of cultural behaviors. You can now write a history of Nigeria without cultural behaviors because you are using a set of archival data that is regulated and constructed differently from the kind of data that is using. So you are going to see rituals in his books. You are going to see legal traditions, and you are going to see heavy dosage of linguistics narrative, in which if you follow the regular pattern in the way we train people, it's a different kind of writing. He established a major impact, and you will see his impact. He was asked to contribute to the UNESCO volumes. And if you study the methodology volume, you are going to see his major impact in shaping that UNESCO series. And he also contributed to the Cambridge series, saying that you must redefine the notion of what you call prehistory. They began to say, why are we using this term? They began to question that terminology. That what is prehistory? What is it telling you? That it's a mislabeling, and the data will say, let's tear this apart. Let's tear that assumption apart. And they study institutions. His book, Kingdom of Cuba, is about institutions, institutional analysis, about dynastic lineages, political events. I have a forthcoming book it will be released in another 1 month. Introduction to African Politics. And what triggered it is that if you reread all these narratives, whether it's Ajayi or Cotton, they also fall into what you call Department of Political Science. Because you can also move them to political science. They cannot do you can't study institutions outside of the frame of politics. They are calling it history, but they are also doing political science. They study ceremonies, they study artistic expression. Vansina is good about regalia, about art history. He did well in writing about art history because that is how his data was talking to him. And he was writing about political systems, which we now define as history. And he pushed us to revisit what we will now call, how we now link mythologies to institutions. That is not a standalone that you push to religious studies, but very embedded in what they were trying to do. Artifacts. Why were they able to write history and also fall into the Department of Art History? It's the nature of the data. Study him again, go and restudy him. You will notice how his project is also embedded in images. I won't have time to do the critiques, you don't need that. It generated a lot of debate. He also revised his own publication. The first one, Oral Traditions and Oral Traditions as History, is a revision. And the book came out in various editions. And he was revising himself. And as his students joined, they were also doing methodological responses. He had been if he had stayed longer, digital archiving would have helped him tremendously in terms of how new systems developed to assist them. But notice those who do indigenous rights, the extent to which they have put his book to use. And notice how almost all these books on Central Africa were read by the country's presidents, and they were read by the judges. That was the tradition in which those books were not just speaking to you as an historian, you understand? They were also speaking to the countries in terms of how they frame their own nations. Do you have a fight over land? Bring Vansina's book. The judge will go and read it. So by the time a book attains that level, you see how it became a source of historical validation. Then, in other words, those who are using the books for validation, they are not grading you in your competence as A, B, B minus. That's not what they were doing. They are using them as credentials. And if they're using a book, they've used my book too as credential, when they give them a crown to the king of my city, they took the book to the court. And what that one does is caution, serious caution in how you are documenting those things. So he left a major intellectual legacy in world history, in anthropology, and in decolonization. And somebody should write an essay on all those figures. And for those of you who are new students in Madison, you must know that it was an empire. It wasn't a department. Madison was an empire. Because if you don't see it as an empire, you miss the point. You miss the point. It was a tripod, so as Madison and later John of Wick. These are empires. So if you see Madison in the 40s, in the 50s as an empire, you will understand. If you see it as an empire, you now see the tension in the 1980s. Because they couldn't produce any students who will not get jobs. No, that was not possible. They will get jobs. At that time, 7 universities were controlling all the jobs in African history, 7 of them. And Madison was one. Just one paragraph reference. How can Crawford Young write you a reference and you won't get a job? Philip Cotton will write you a reference, you won't get a job. It's not possible. And now in the 80s, as centers of production expanded, some by their own students, Tom Spear, John Miller went to University of Virginia, Lovejoy in Toronto, Martin Klein, the centers, the empire began to decline. Because like all empires, whether it's Mali or Songhai, there will be subsidiarities. So Vansina and his colleagues produce subsidiarities, right? Who became leaders of colonies. And those colonies, they didn't say they want to demolish the empire, but as they created their own powerful colonies, their own students began to get jobs. When structural adjustment program devastated Africa and we began to live, the margins now began to attack the empire. If you reread Philip Cotton Get to Size in Africa, it was directed at 3 of us. So Odiambo got a job. Price wrote a major book, notably on CIA. And they began to use for David Cohen idea on what we now call postcoloniality. Some members of the older empire did not quickly catch on to that. And our colleagues from India joined subaltern studies. I was colleague with Chakrabarti of Chicago in Australian National University. It was difficult to immediately relate subaltern studies to what they are doing, although they pioneered what our Indian colleagues did in the 40s and 50s. African perspective of history. That's what it is. That's what they were calling it. Then, as these multiple centers were established, and people now began to come from Africa, the centers began to multiply. I was the one who started the PhD program in Austin. And the dean and the head said, can one person create a PhD program? How can one person create a PhD program? And I said, I will figure it out. Years later, Madison had 15 students, because I said, okay, let me work a technique, because you have to work out a technique that will fight the empire. And ultimately, we now have so many centers, and we're now in a moment of chaos that we do not know, as I stand before you, how to manage this chaos in the era of the ultimate chaos master by the name of Donald Trump. I didn't say that. So, the second part, what then happened after his demise? What really happened? When you say what happened, part of what you are trying to say is what was not there before, and how we reimagine the disciplines. The issue is not that any discipline will stay still. That's not the idea. They will be reimagined in ways that the ancestors, the dead people, may not be happy with. And in that reimagination, we have new definitions of what it means. We have today a great challenge to my generation, who are doing nationalist historiography, my generation. We never did history for history's sake. Nobody did that when I was in school. We connected history to the nation-state project. The fields, there was a year we were doing searches, and as each person comes in, they were citing the same scholar, my friend at NYU. They will say, according to Cooper, according to Cooper, according to Cooper. And I'll be laughing. What happens is, when Africans study outside of Africa, they disconnected the discipline from nation building. Because the center of the discipline was about nation building. Why did you go to school? That was the framing. Why did you go to school? And you see it in Achebe no longer at ease. You went to school because of your community. That degree was tied to how you are going to elevate your community and the nation. If you look at the programs in African universities, that was the intention. Today, it is about how you are going to bring tourists. History and heritage studies, history and museum studies, history and archeology. When you focus on nation building, you should have pre-warned me. He said I have 70 more minutes. She said, did you write 70 or 10? And I'm not enjoying, this is the part I love. Okay, so there was no well-developed postcolonialism, no well-developed globalization studies the way we now have it. After the fall of apartheid, indigenous knowledge systems developed, which is now what people are talking about in terms of what is your contribution to African indigenous knowledge, what is your relevance outside of the academy. If you are not going to get jobs in the academy, how do we redraw the boundaries of the discipline and empower you with alternative jobs? I even have a student who did a PhD under me and he's now a pastor. It's not a joke. Can I ask you to go and do a diploma in chaplaincy? So we now respond to how career is diminishing in specific fields. We are now rethinking, and now tell some students, why don't you go and do law on the campus if they admit you? And people are now pursuing all those. As they pursue all those, they pressuring the discipline to move in different directions. And very soon we are going to find people with PhDs who will be working on Wall Street, which is why I'm excited by your next speaker. And the students, you better talk to him or to her that you work. How can you use your degree in the financial market? And as we now focus in terms of diversifying career options, the discipline will be forced to respond in ways that the Vansina generation cannot process, because we're just producing for the academy. Now, if you strictly say you are producing for the academy, you may be endangering some lives, unfortunately. Let me now close with the only PowerPoint I want to use. I was one not to move around. So I want to talk about my own current work, because exactly what they were doing, I have not fully departed from it. I have appropriated all the new challenges, but the core of my work is still grounded in what Vansina was doing. There's my memoir that James spoke about. It's oral, it's just oral. That's all what it is about. You can't go to the archives to be writing about your own life. You're just writing it. And it was voted as one of the best childhood memoirs ever written. But it's about my community, an organic community that I was reflecting about. I want to move forward. Do I just press this one? I'm a high school dropout. I'm very proud of that. It's true. Some people are always ashamed that they drop out of high school. I dropped out in secondary school. I only spent 2 years. So I dropped out. Did my exam, GC level, A level, did them at home. And I wrote about why I dropped out, in which I joined the first major post-colonial peasant rebellion in Africa, in southwestern Nigeria. They call it the Bekoya movement. And it dovetails with the history of the Nigerian Civil War. And I said, let me be the voice of these persons who lost their lives. And I did that. Granted, not in any archives, but in oral traditions. This is my latest memoir. It's 2 weeks old. It's just completely oral tradition. My encounter with Islam is just the methodology of Vansina. That's it. No archival records, nothing. In which is my third memoir. And I'm writing my fourth memoir on fatherhood, the relationship between myself and my daughter. Jacqueline there was telling us at dinner the relationship between her and the father. Now I'm writing about my own daughter and myself. I can just say one sentence about that. I moved the three of them out of Nigeria in 1989, and they began what I call a detribalization process. Those of you who are born here into a monoculture, you do not know how difficult it is for an immigrant to raise children. It is the most difficult thing because there are value issues. I was born into a tribe, not in its negative European coinage. I was born into a tribe. And as I moved my children out of Nigeria, the process became detribalized. That process of detribalization, one of you should write a PhD topic on it. It is so difficult that you just find it very difficult to manage. So I did this book outside of the archives because I was in the choir myself. And I began to study sacred words. The words, their meanings are gone. Their meanings are gone. And in those sacred words, the Yoruba call it incantations and things like that. If you're a Christian, the psalm is magic. If you're a good Christian, the psalm is about magic. That's what it is. That's what Christians use the psalm for. It's magical. And if you study Islam, you find magic. When I was young, they would take a tablet and write Islamic sentences on them. They would wash them into a cup and drink it. Because those verses, they are not just religious verses. They are magical verses. Implication, I can do implication. I can give you verses to do certain things. And if you think this is a joke, it is not. Because in countries like Nigeria, it has been fully revived into ritual money. Why are you in school? Why don't you grab your brother and use your brother for money? If you're a woman in Nigerian university, they must not see your pad or your underwear because they will convert them to rituals. You see how older ideas are being walked back. And if you watch Nollywood, you are just watching witchcraft. And you say, but they went to school, yes. They go to school. These are people with PhDs and BA and bachelors. But they walk back all these ideas that you think are dead. They are not dead. In my introduction to having a girlfriend, because I wasn't handsome, I can't speak very well, I turned to sacred words, which I will utter. All what I needed to know was the name of the mother of the girl I like. And I will use the sacred words to command her, whether you like it or not, you're going to fall in love with me. I'm just telling you the possibility of this orality, the organicity, that we should not be treating them as if they're dead. They can be revived, and I'm using them as epistemologists. This is my most eccentric book ever. It's the most eccentric, and it won the Emory Talbot Award, the Anthropology Award for the best book in 2022. I pose the question, suppose I return to the Garden of Eden. It's a very eccentric book. So what does it mean if you are all dead, I'm the only one in the world? Does it mean there'll be no history? I converted myself into an archive. That's what I did. Over 500 pages. So I wrote a chapter on my dresses because I design my clothes. I collected 3,000 women's hair. Please, can I take your hair? I wrote on that, and I began to say, why are we not using autoethnography, the study of the self, as an archive? And the first chapter told you how to do it, that everybody that is here is an archive. Now, why are you wasting your money traveling to an archive when you already embody an archive? And you take yourself and convert yourself into a narrative. And I said, look, for people to take this seriously, I will publish it with Cambridge University Press. Because if I don't do that, they would just, some people would say, they would dismiss it. And I said, no, you're not going to dismiss it. And I'm happy. This is 2 weeks old because I'm now writing on metaphysics. Jacob read this book and it challenged me so severely. It challenged me. What Jacob did for me is he rejected my framing of comparing metaphysics with Western metaphysics. That's what he did. Saying, look, and he let me stay within the integrity of that metaphysics. I'm very, very proud of this book. No archives. No archives. It's just say, what are the concepts of analysis that they were using in that community? And I took that concept into a book of over 400 pages. And I'm waiting for the reviews. And finally, Wisconsin will release my book next year on divination and Ifa craft. I went to become an apprentice, just as Vansina told us to do. I became an apprentice to a priest of Ifa, working with him, studying with him, just reading oral tradition, A Quest for Chimera by David Enig, reading Heret, reading Vansina. How do you study one person? It's a methodology. And I went, just one person. I said, I'm not interested in generalities. And I went to this priest, diviner, and I studied under him. And I have two knowledges. The book that Wisconsin will release on Ifa craft, that's what I call it. Our Ifa craft is an epistemology. Jacob also read the book for me, the manuscript. And having mastered that, the generalized metaphysics, one person, I also have a second job now. I'm no longer just a scholar. I can establish a place for any of you in this class to come and discuss your future with me. And I will tell you how you are going to end. Thank you very much.